today's topic for editorial discussion is how can India lead multilateralism at World Trade Organization. So this is what this article deals about. So recently what has happened is that recent G20 meeting has concluded. G20 working group meeting on trade and investment. That meeting was concluded, and this particular meeting, what it did was it focused on WTO reforms, World Trade Organization reforms. That is what this particular meeting has focused on. So what this article deals with is that it suggests 4 types of reforms that can be done by India as the G20 president. So currently India is holding the presidency of G20. So what can India do to further reforms at WTO? So that is what this article deals with, and it holds 4 pillars that what India can do. So yes, 50 to 60 years back, 50 to 50 years down the history lane, we find that all global countries, they were focusing on economic interdependence. Interdependence in the sense, US was dependent on India, India was dependent on Russia, another country, US, and all these countries in the terms of economics. So countries were economically interdependent. So fast forwarding to today, so why one main reason why countries were economically interdependent is that there are a lot of other economic reasons also, but one security related reason is that due to further interdependence, the security confrontations and security issues can be minimized. So that is one particular reason why a lot of countries 50 to 60 years back, they were indulging in economic interdependence with other countries across the globe. So fast forwarding to today, the 20th century, 21st century, the second decade of the 20th century, we find a lot of countries, especially the well-developed ones like US and all, or US and the West, what they are doing is that they are moving towards something called as unilateralism or protectionist type of regimes and protectionist types of policies. So protectionism in the sense, it is me, myself, unilateral decisions, the decisions that surround that particular country, as opposed to the multilateral order that was prevalent before. So why such countries are moving towards protectionism? One thing that they cite is that decision making is very much easy when it comes to unilateralism, and one major thing that those countries that are indulging in protectionist measures or protectionist regimes cite that they are trying to protect their national interest and as well as their local interest. National interest in the sense, they are not willing to indulge in multilateral issues and multilateral developmental agendas and all. So they are highly inward thinking. They are highly, some are also criticizing such countries as highly self-absorbed. So yes, that thing is very much present in today's world. And there has been a lot of power play between great economic powers. We all know one of the greatest power play is going on between US and China. So this has all led to China and US getting more and more protectionist and more unilateral in their economic policies and all. So that is where India can usher in to bring World Trade Organization reforms. There are also other experts who have cited that the WTO reforms, the reforms in multilateralism has to be brought in by G20 middle powers. So there are high powers in G20, not abrupt classifications, but there are certain highly developed countries such as the US and all. US and the West are there. There are also developing and emerging economies, newly emerging economies such as India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, all these and all like middle powers of G20, and some experts have suggested that reforms in G20 and WTO has to be ushered in, has to be brought in by these middle powers such as India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil and all. So yes, these experts, they also suggest 4 cardinal pillars or principles upon which these WTO reforms must be placed on. So what are these 4 principal reforms? The first cardinal pillar is that of Sdt provisions, special and differential treatment provisions. Though there are special and differential treatment means, yes, in the developmental spectrum, not all countries are at the same level. There are a lot of developing countries, there are a lot of developed countries, there are a lot of least developing countries or underdeveloped countries also. So yes, this is how the development spectrum is arranged. This is how the developmental spectrum is arranged. So in order to give special treatment or in order to give special rights to those or the lower levels of the developmental spectrum, there is this small provision called as special and differential treatment. So yes, developed countries are there, they have to give some sort of special provisions or differential provisions to developing and least developing countries. So that is what this STT provision is. So this STT provision has been a part and parcel of WTO even in the past, but its functioning and its implementation is where it lags, is where most countries lag. And a particular study shows that 21% of WTO agreements have this thing called as STT provisions, and developed countries are obliged to give STT provisions for developing countries. Only 21% is there. So there are a lot of WTO agreements, but only 21% are obliged. Obliged in the sense they are obliged to give to developing countries. So that is one big issue, sir, and that has to be resolved when it comes to WTO reform. So that is the first principle regarding special and differential treatment, how developing countries must be given special rights or special treatment from developed countries. And why reform here is that we have already seen that only 21% are obliged, only 21% of the agreements in which developed countries are obliged to give to developing countries. So that is one issue there that has to be handled with care, hopefully by India's presidency. Yes, and another thing is the appellate body. We all know that the dispute settlement mechanism of WTO has two preliminary bodies or two preliminary stages. The first stage is that of the dispute panel, and the dispute panel's report, it goes to the appellate board, and then it goes to the dispute settlement board, which is also the governing council. The governing council only sits as the DSB. So yes, appellate board reforms. Thing is, appellate board, what is happening in recent times is that this appellate board has been paralyzed since 2017, and one major reason is that US has been playing in such a manner to reduce the powers of the appellate board, so that all its policies and all its programs and schemes, all its protectionist policies, all these policies will go on without any disruption or without any barrier from the appellate body or from the WTO. So this is one thing, this is one matter which US has done to reduce the policing rights or policing powers of the appellate body. So that has to be handled, that has to be addressed also by other G20 middle powers or India in its G20 presidency. So yes, that is another pillar of reform suggested by various experts. So third pillar is governance framework. Governance framework in the sense not regular governance framework, but yes, we will see what this governance framework deals with or what it means. So yes, all these decisions when it comes to the WTO, these are all taken in the basis of consensus. It is consensus based decision making only has been followed in WTO. But the slowness, but this consensus based mechanism, it is very much slow. The slowness of this mechanism has led to various other mechanisms such as the plurilateral mechanisms or plurilateral agreements, wherein a group of countries agree and all these things can happen. So yes, this is one thing that has been happening. So yes, plurilateral agreements, they are welcome, they are quick, they are effective, but one thing that has to be addressed here is there is no governance framework when it comes to plurilateral frameworks. Plurilateral frameworks, they are not governed, there are no mechanism for governing those mechanisms. So that is what this governance frameworks mean. So we need a model governance framework for plurilateral agreements. And another thing with respect to plurilateral agreements is that, okay, a group of countries can accept, they might accept what is being discussed there, but this plurilateral agreement, it should not be imposed on other non-willing members, and that has to be handled. So that is why we need something called as the governance framework that governs the issues related to plurilateral agreements or plurilateral decision making. So that thing has to be framework that has to be brought into implementation, and this framework, this governance framework on plurilateral agreements, it must also make sure that it is not unilateral, that it is not that it is inclusive, that it is transparent, and it is not discriminatory, non-discriminatory, non-unilateral. It is inclusive and transparent. So these are the major components that must make up this governance framework when it comes to plurilateral agreements. So yes, this is the third pillar which experts have suggested that India can contribute to through G20 presidency. And transparency gaps. Transparency gaps. We all know what transparency is. Transparency gap. Transparency gap. There is no transparency. That is what transparency gaps means. So India has to address this transparency gaps also. There are a lot of transparency gaps when it comes to WTO reforms. Transparency gaps in terms of notification requirements. When a country is indulging in some trade issue or some tariff or some barrier, economic or barrier and all, they have to notify it to the WTO. A lot of countries do not do that. No, they are obliged to notify, but a lot of countries do not do that. So this is where the transparency gap is widening. This is where the transparency gap comes into place. You are obliged to notify your changes or trade policies, but you are not doing so. This is where the transparency gap comes in. So this transparency gap, it also leads to a large scale trust deficit among other countries who are doing this notification and all. So in order to address this trust issue and to fill this transparency gap, we'll have to bring in a mechanism to address this transparency gap. So this can also be done by India as the G20 president. So there's been a talk amongst the global powers with respect to multilateralism and unilateralism. We all know multilateralism is everyone for everyone. Like there are groupings. There are at least 3 or more countries coming together and taking decisions. That is what multilateralism is. On a much larger scale, it is the entire globe coming together and taking decisions, especially when it comes to trade issues like some sorts of pacts and all, or agreements such as the Stdt agreement and all these things, or WTO principles. So yes, this is what multilateralism is. And unilateralism is that taking individual decisions or individual perspectives for vested interest. So yes, there is a debate that multilateralism is of the past and unilateralism is the talk of the day. But yes, developed countries may think that unilateralism is the talk of the town. Unilateralism is what they need. It might have been out of fashion. Multilateralism might have been out of fashion for the US and other developed countries, but it holds much vital salience or much vital significance for developing countries like India, Indonesia and all such developing nations and least developed nations. So what India must do as the G20 president is it must inculcate in its policies as the G20 president all these frameworks that are targeted as WTO reforms. It must, to its maximum, it must try to bring or usher in such changes or such reforms to the World Trade Organization. Thank you.